Thank you, Dame Eleanor. Whilst I cannot match the technical analysis of my honourable and learned friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, what I hope I can bring to the deliberations today is some practical experience of the implications of new clauses 2 and new clauses 5. Honouring agreements has been at the heart of international trade since such trade began, but it is worth remembering that it has not always been, and the governments have not always supported international trade. And if you look back at the approach of our government and other governments in Europe from the 16th century, the 17th century, and even well into the 18th century, you will see that we operated mercantilist policies that actively prevented international trade. Such trade was discouraged, and the reason was to protect domestic manufacture. Policies such as very high border tariffs were implemented. There was even an export of tools which could be used to improve manufacture in third countries. And many arcane rules and requirements to use local suppliers and local trades were implemented again to make it harder to undertake international trade. And there was no support for the legal enforcement of contracts. Businesses consequently had to make their own arrangements, and these founded primarily on that of personal trust, on reputation of an organisation, and also of family. And I have some personal experience of that. I was once recruited by my brother to help work in his company, eventually as the managing director. And his rationale was that he had no idea whether I was competent at anything, but he did know that I was unlikely to steal from him. So whether that was ultimately good for the economy of that business, I'll leave it to other people to decide. But on an international basis, that approach has been disastrous. Throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, there was a general stultification of growth. But I'm delighted to say it was the United Kingdom that led the world from narrow protectionism towards free trade. And that great man, Adam Smith, led the charge. He destroyed the argument for protectionism. He demonstrated the desirability of imports. They're more efficiently produced and therefore cheaper, and stated that exports were merely the necessary cost of acquiring them. And so it is through this place that we led the way in the repeal of protectionist laws, firstly with the Reciprocity of Duties Act back in 1823, and then much more famously with the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. And what was the result? Well, we look around us today. It was the explosion of world trade. Now, PIL agreements have been crucial to the modern support of that international trade. And they bring legal certainty, they deal with conflicts of jurisdiction, and they allow for judgments to be enforced internationally. This bill helps to achieve these aims, particularly as we transition from the EU into the big wide world. And that is relevant, that transition period, and I'll come back to it later in my speech, because of the time constraints that imposes on Her Majesty's government. I'm going to return to my first-hand experience of the impact of PIL agreements. As the managing director of a UK-based SME that was entrepreneurial in its outlook, we were doing pretty well in the UK, and so naturally I looked to international markets as a means for expansion. And in my time, I negotiated joint ventures in Russia, in the United States of America, in Australia, and in South Africa, as well as preliminary discussions in a number of other jurisdictions. And yet it is very noticeable that the only two joint ventures which we progressed to fruition were in the United States of America and in Australia. And the fundamental reason why I felt unable to progress further in those other jurisdictions was because of fears over the enforceability of contract, particularly in relation to intellectual property, and fears over the effectiveness of the rule of law in those jurisdictions. PIL agreements affect countless such economic decisions all around the world, in this country, every day. So we must not underestimate their importance for economic decisions just like the ones that I took. There is an urgent need for more PIL agreements, particularly as we move out of the transition period. It is an integral part of our pivot towards global Britain. And in my submission, there should be no delay, no unnecessary delay, in the government's ability to, first of all, negotiate such PIL agreements, but then to bring them into force. Because international enforceability is key to trade growth, it's key to London remaining the centre of dispute resolution around the world, and it's key to the continued dominance of English and Welsh law. And that, it's worth reminding ourselves, Madam Chair, is dominant because the law is predictable in its interpretation, and predictable in its enforceability. That is a key advantage for this jurisdiction. Now, I understand well the concerns which have been raised by old Clause 2 and new Clause 5. And as a backbencher, I stand here to defend the rights of Parliament. But it is also right to defend those rights of Parliament with a sense of proportion. PIL agreements are significant, and I've done my best to explain quite how significant they have been to international commerce in my previous comments. They are significant, but they are fundamentally uncontroversial. They are not major treaties in the sense of Maastricht, as was mentioned by a previous speaker. And we do need to have some practical considerations weighing on our mind as we look to whether we should implement new Clause 5 or not. The transition period is a time when we should be lifting our eyes to the wider horizons of international trade. And that's going to need more PIL agreements, many more. And as my honourable friend and member for Henley highlighted, agility, the government's ability to strike whilst the iron is hot, to take advantage of this brave new world into which we're entering, is a very material, practical consideration. We also have the legislative timetable to consider. We are already clogged up with COVID-related delays in the legislative timetable. To then require multiple acts of Parliament to be progressed through that clogged up legislative timetable in order to progress what are time-sensitive and critical agreements is, in my mind, disproportionate. And it will have negative delay on the domestic agenda of the government as it seeks to progress this stodge, and also delay to the implementation of the PIL agreements themselves. So in conclusion, Madam Chair, as a businessman, as a backbencher defending the rights of this Parliament, I operate that sense of proportion. And my conclusion is that I do not feel that it is a proportionate approach to prevent the government from using secondary legislation in this manner. And consequently, I do support the government's new Clause 5, and I'm against new Clause 2.
Deanna Davison.